Hi, my name is Maeve, and I did my spring independent study on Roman mythology and Latin. I chose to do this independent study because I have completed all of the Latin courses offered at PCDS, but I wanted to continue my study of Latin a little bit longer so that I could finish out my final year. I chose Roman mythology in particular because I've always really enjoyed Greek mythology, and I wanted to look at more of the Roman side of it, and I also have always found that to be one of my favorite things that we've talked about in Latin classes in the past, so I figured I would focus a little bit more on that. What I did for my independent study is I focused really just on the gods and goddesses that are the primary parts of Roman mythology, talked about like their stories, what their jobs are, and so on. And so I'm going to go through kind of like mainly what I did, and then I put it all together in a magazine. So I'll talk a little bit about like my research and work process in the end. So the first god that I researched was Jupiter. He's the chief of Pantheon and protector of ancient Rome. He's the son of Saturn, which is Kronos in Greek mythology. Jupiter is also Zeus in Greek mythology. And a big role of Jupiter is that he's the king of the gods because Saturn swallows all of his children, and Jupiter tricks him and ends up freeing his siblings and then defeating Saturn. He's married to Juno. He's the father of many gods, goddesses, heroes like Mars and Hercules. His symbols are the lightning bolt, the eagle, and the tree. And the story that I wrote about was the story of Jupiter and Io. Jupiter falls in love with a woman named Io, and Juno, his wife, is jealous, and so he turns her into a cow to hide her from Juno. But he later rescues her after Juno punishes her. So the next god that I talked about was Neptune. He's the ruler of the sea, the god of horses, earthquakes. He is the brother of Jupiter, Pluto, and son of Saturn as well. He carries a trident. He protects sailors, but he's also in charge of the oceans and causes storms and like earthquakes, floods that also harm sailors. So he has that kind of like double-edged role that is both dangerous and helpful. He rode a chariot pulled by immortal horses, and the story that I talked about was his role in the Odyssey. I think the Odyssey oftentimes focuses on things like Circe and Polyphemus, but I also thought it was interesting what like a pivotal role Neptune plays, especially since I've read the Odyssey before. And he is the one that like sends Odysseus on his long journey because Odysseus blinded his son, who is Polyphemus. The next god is Pluto. Pluto is like Hades in Greek mythology. He's the god of the dead, ruler of the underworld. He controls places like Tartarus and the Elysian Fields, which is the afterlife in Roman mythology. His symbols are Cerberus, the three-headed dog, the bident, an invisibility helmet, keys. He's married to Proserpina, which is the daughter of Ceres, and then there's like a whole myth behind that as well. And the story that I talked about though is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, where Orpheus is a man, his wife Eurydice his wife or like lover Eurydice dies, and Orpheus goes down into the underworld to try and save her, and then Pluto creates like a whole test to try and like see if Orpheus can get her back. He ultimately does it. So the next god is Ceres. She is the goddess of agriculture, harvest, plants, and fertility. Important protector of the crops, nourishment in Rome. Her symbols are wheat, grain, torches, and pigs. And the story that I wrote about was King, I'm definitely gonna mess up how you say this, but it's like Eurysicon, and he's a king who he cuts down her sacred tree, and she ends up cursing him with eternal hunger, and he ends up like eating himself. So it was about her sacred tree, and not to disparage that. Vesta is the goddess of the hearth and the home. She's oftentimes depicted as a flame and not actually in like a human looking form. She also represents like domestic stability, family, safety of Rome. She had these priestesses called the Vestal Virgins, and the Vestal Virgins show up a lot in Latin texts. So I definitely had heard the Vestal Virgin term a lot since like learning Latin in 7th grade. So that was kind of interesting to read a little bit more about her in particular. And then the story that I talked about was Priapus, where there's this man, Priapus, he was trying to like attack her or make moves on her, and this donkey like ends up making noise and alerting men to come and save her. And the donkey is then considered like a sacred donkey because he woke the gods. The next is Juno. So Juno is the queen of the gods. She is the wife of Jupiter, and she's the mother of Mars and Vulcan. Her sacred animals are the peacock and the goose. She was celebrated during the Matronalia festival, and the story that I talked about was Juno and Argus, where Juno discovers that Jupiter had his affair with Io, and she places Argus to guard her. Argus's 100 eyes later become the markings of the Peacock Festival, which is also peacock feathers, which is also her like sacred animal. The next two they talked about were Venus and Mars. So Venus is the goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite. Mars is like Ares, god of war, agriculture, farming, and fertility. Venus is married to Vulcan, but she's the lover of Mars. There's a lot of stories about the like love triangle between the three of them. Her symbols are the dove, roses, mirrors, and seashells. She's connected to the founding of Rome through her son Aeneas. The story that I talked about was the Trojan War, where Venus wins the golden apple from Paris and promises him Helen in return. That's why she got the golden apple, which ultimately when he gets Helen, that's what starts the Trojan War. I think a lot of people have heard the story of like the Trojan horse, so I always love listening and hearing about like the Roman mythology side of the Trojan War that's not just about like the Helen and the city of Troy and whatever stuff like that, but the actual like why he even had Helen in the first place. Mars, he is the god of war, but he's also linked to farming and fertility. He's the father of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. And his symbols include spears, shields, helmets, and armor. His sacred animals were the wolf and the woodpecker. And the story that I talked about was Mars and Minerva. I thought this one was really interesting because in it, basically Mars pursues Minerva, who I'll talk about later romantically, but she rejects him. And the moral of this story is that like wisdom always triumphs over aggression, and even in stuff like warfare, like good planning strategy will always win over brute force. So I thought the moral of that story is cool. And then there are some pictures. This painting, the Venus one, is very famous. Minerva is the goddess of wisdom, learning, arts, and strategy. She was born from Jupiter's head with no mother. And her symbols are the owl, olive branch, shield, and books. The story that I talked about is one of a pretty more well-known story, the story of Minerva and Arachne, where Minerva punishes Arachne for claiming that she can weave better, and they have like a weaving competition, and she turns Arachne into a spider. Apollo is the god of the sun, music, poetry, prophecy, healing, and archery. He's the twin brother of Diana. His symbols are the lyre, the laurel wreath, bow and arrows, and he's connected to the famous oracle of Delphi, who appears in a lot of Greek and Roman mythology and just like stories in general. The story that I talked about was Apollo and Daphne. Apollo falls in love with this woman, Daphne, and she runs from him because she is not interested, and she ends up being saved by getting turned into a laurel tree. And this is like a metamorphoses story that's pretty popular, and one of those like metamorphosis, people turning into things that are very common in Roman literature. Diana is the goddess of the hunt, wilderness, moon, and childbirth. She's the protector of nature and young women. She's known for independence, purity, and strength. She carried bow and arrows, roamed forests. Her main story that I talked about was Actaeon, which is where this hunter, Actaeon, tries to like see her bathing. And so she turns him into a stag as punishment, and he ends up being killed by his own dogs. Okay, so before I started this independent study, I think that I knew a bit about like the gods and goddesses from Greek mythology, but less so from Roman mythology. I knew some of the basic stuff, but I didn't know a lot of like the more specific stories that I looked into, so that was very interesting to learn. A big thing that I found interesting learning about was kind of like being able to understand the lifestyle and cultures and religion of Rome through just like seeing what kind of gods they worshipped. Something that I didn't know was that a lot, if not all, of the gods are in some way linked to fertility of like people and of crops. And so obviously it kind of makes sense. You're living in ancient Rome. You have to be able to have fertile crops that produce food so that you can all eat when it comes time for the harvest. And then fertile humans so that women can give birth to children and your society continues to reproduce. And I definitely like didn't know that like Mars, for example, was linked to fertility. There are also some other things where gods and goddesses are like gods and goddesses of more than just one thing. So like Apollo is a good example of that. I didn't know that he was linked to prophecy. And obviously prophecy comes up a lot in all of Roman and Greek mythology. So those were some things that I didn't really know as much about before I started the independent study, but through this research I've learned about. If I did this independent study again, I think I would have focused less on the like overall fun facts, things like what is so-and-so's role, what are their symbols, because I do think I kind of already knew a lot of that stuff, and I probably would have just read more stories, because the stories were interesting. A lot of them I don't know. There's lots of stories out there, and so I think I would have probably just focused on like specific just stories and not really gone into the stuff that I knew more about already. Also, I would have talked about Vulcan and Proserpina, because those were two gods that I consider in my mind like to be major gods, and I kind of just like forgot about them and never did a page on them. So I think I would have. Vulcan's one I also think that I know less about, so it would have been nice to do a little more research on him. My research practices, I really just read. I read a lot. I have a book that I read from. I borrowed some books from my advisor, Miss Anderson. And I read a lot of stuff online, went on websites. It was pretty much just reading and writing. And then I also decided to keep translating. As part of this independent study, I wanted to have it be relating to Latin still. And so I continued to translate. I got some text from Miss Anderson. One of the ones that I did was this text Ennius, but I looked through a bunch of different things. The thing that I thought was interesting was that there's not as much Latin text specifically on Roman mythology as I thought there would be. Like Roman mythology appears a lot in Latin stories, but to have like a set text that's like the story of Minerva or something like that stuff is not as easy to find. I thought it'd be easier. I still kept translating, which was definitely nice. And I'm glad that I got to finish out the year with Latin. And that's it. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed this independent study. I definitely learned a lot. And my final project is that magazine, which I will be sending out. Thank you.